Hello, this is November the 4th, 2018. If I'm not mistaken, I think it's the 60th anniversary of John the 23rd becoming Pope, but I could be wrong about that. But it's the 31st Sunday of the year, and the first reading is that well-known one from Deuteronomy 6. Moses spoke to the people, saying, "Fear Yahweh your God, and keep throughout the days of your lives all his statutes and commandments which I enjoin on you, and thus have long life. Hear then, O Israel, and be careful to observe them, that you may grow and prosper the more, in keeping with the promise of Yahweh, the God of your fathers, to give you a land flowing with milk and honey. Hear, O Israel, Yahweh is our God, Yahweh alone. Therefore you shall love Yahweh your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength. Take to heart these words which I enjoin on you today." The word of the Lord. The second reading is again from the letter to the Hebrews, and again emphasizes his tie-in with Jesus with the ancient Jewish priesthood, something which we really have problems with today on different levels, and something which, if you're not Jewish, really doesn't make a lot of sense. That's why the letter's called the letter to the Hebrews, the letter to the Jews. Brothers and sisters, the Levitical priests were many, because they were prevented by death from remaining in office. But Jesus, because he remains forever, has a priesthood that does not pass away. Therefore he is always able to save those who approach God through him, since he lives forever to make intercession for them. It was fitting that we should have such a high priest, holy, innocent, undefiled, separated from sinners, higher than the heavens. He has no need, as did the high priest, to offer sacrifice day after day, first for his own sins, and then for those of the people. He did that once for all when he offered himself. For the law appoints men subject to weakness to be high priest. But the word of the oath which was taken after the law adopts a son, who has been made perfect forever. The word of the Lord. And the gospel is that very famous one that we should have learned probably in our very first classes of Sunday school or Catholic education somehow or another in our catechism classes. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. One of the scribes came to Jesus and asked, "Which is the first of all the commandments?" Jesus replied, "The first is this: Hear, O Israel, Yahweh our God is Yahweh alone. You shall love Yahweh your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this: You shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these." The scribe said to him, "Well said, teacher. You are right in saying he is one, and there is no other than he. And to love him with all your heart, with all your understanding, with all your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself is worth more than all burnt offerings and sacrifices." And when Jesus saw that he answered with understanding, he said to him, "You are not far from the kingdom of God." And no one dared to ask him any more questions. The Gospel of the Lord. As I mentioned last week, the Bartimaeus story is the last thing Jesus does before he enters Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. And so everything else in the Gospel, except for the actual Passion narrative in Mark, actually takes place in the last 5 days of Jesus in Jerusalem. And on some level, those first couple of days reminds me of Grant's fighting the Confederates in the Battle of the Wilderness in the Civil War. The problem with Grant was he simply never left up. He constantly kept fighting, never stopping, and both Grant and Lincoln knew if he did that, the Confederacy could not possibly last. And that's exactly what happens with Jesus and his enemies in the city of Jerusalem. They are locked in constant battle. And it's kind of interesting because when the scribe, the person who studies the Jewish law, asked him about what's the most important law, he's presuming Jesus is a Pharisee. And Pharisees at the time of Jesus zeroed in on the 613 laws of Moses. Supposedly, they're the 613 laws in the Torah, in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And somehow or another, rabbis or scribes or people who studied the law would constantly debate the value of one law over another one. If you had to do this, then do you have to do that? Back and forth, this would be part of the argument. But no Pharisee would argue with Jesus giving the first law, the most important law that he gives. And the most important law is that you love Yahweh, as he says. That would be something all Pharisees would agree with. They would also zero in on the law in Leviticus 19, basically about you are to love your neighbor as yourself. One of the things that makes Jesus unique isn't that he gives these two laws, but that he joins these two laws together and says basically that you show your love of God by how much and how deeply you love your neighbor. They aren't two separate events. They both take place in the same way. And I think sometimes what we do, though, is to separate them. And I sometimes have difficulty with the Catholic practice of benediction or veneration of Jesus in the Blessed Sacrament. I certainly do not question the motives of the people who do this. Our family's great aunt, Sister Narbertine, a Franciscan hospital of the Third Order in her retirement years, had Eucharistic adoration every night for several hours, starting like at 3 o'clock in the morning. And I realized that was part of her holiness, that was part of her own spirituality. But I've often said, and even written articles about it, when you worship Jesus and say God, as Catholics believe, is in that Eucharist, in the Blessed Sacrament, and you venerate the Blessed Sacrament, that we basically create the image of Jesus in the Blessed Sacrament. I don't think any of us believe Jesus is a piece of bread, or looks like a piece of bread, or has the qualities of a piece of bread only. I think if we wanted to be more honest with today's gospel passage, we have to say, I think we should be putting not so much a piece of bread in that monstrance, we should be putting pictures of people in the community. I've seen those picture frames where the photographs in there constantly flip over. So you might have one particular picture for 15 seconds and then it flips over to another person for 15 seconds, back and forth. If you wish to have a monstrance, if you wish to have Eucharistic devotion or perpetual adoration, I think we have to have those picture frames on our altars constantly flipping over with picture after picture after picture. And we should be willing even to put pictures of people that we don't like very much, or people who are having problems with us psychologically, physically. People like that should be in that particular frame. If we are to be Christians, we have to hook those two laws together. If you grew up like I did as a Catholic and went to your first communion and then communions afterward in a Catholic parish morning after morning after morning, one of the things that every Catholic kid remembers is don't gawk around after you receive communion. You're supposed to get up from the communion rail, kind of have your eyes cast down, still find your place in church in your right pew, and whatever you do, don't look left or right, up or down, just look straight ahead, trying to venerate Jesus inside of you. And even the sisters that we had, school sisters in Notre Dame, who so generously taught me for 8 years or so, 9 years, in grade school, they had this particular custom that when they went up to communion, and if you remember we all knelt at the communion rail back then, nobody stood, They would do what we World War II generation kids would refer to as pull the pin. That when the sisters got up from the communion rail, they had a straight pin somehow holding their veil up. They would pull that pin out and the veil would come down over their face. And they would be totally, I guess, ensconced in this little chapel or something that they created for themselves so they wouldn't be distracted by anyone. And just a parenthesis, of course, we kids would test to see if they could see out of that veil. And I hate to tell you, but they could, because they'd get us sometimes for gawking around ourselves. I'm afraid now some liturgists stress the fact that we should be looking around when we receive communion. We should actually be staring at other people when we go up and come back from receiving the Eucharist, both the bread and the cup. And the reason we should be looking around is receiving Jesus should be a motivation to see Jesus or experience Jesus in all those around us, which means we should really look at those around us. It isn't something that we conjure up in the back of our minds. We should have a concrete picture of what those individuals look like. And nothing is more concrete than actually staring at them, seeing them there. It's impossible in a way, if people are around us when we receive communion, to have a distraction. There's no distraction. We might be weak, like the author of Hebrews says, that somehow or another we can't really always do everything God wishes us to do. That's why Jesus did it so well one time, once for all, across the board. But at the same time, we have to keep working at that. More and more, we have to keep discovering the risen Jesus in people around us. That's what Jesus says in today's gospel. There's no doubt of that. He would be amazed that people would concentrate on a piece of bread, now the Eucharistic body of Jesus, but concentrate on Jesus in that format. I'm afraid Jesus in today's gospel would say, you have to look around and see me as the risen Jesus in everybody around you. That takes a big job to do that. That isn't easy, and it's something that even the author of Deuteronomy says, if we're going to love God with all our strength, we have to keep zeroing in that strength more and more on other people. We simply can't say that I saw Jesus once in a picture in a catechism when I was a kid. I'm afraid we have to be very open and say we see Jesus every time we look around us. That should distinguish Christians from others, that we don't have to have special adorations of God. We can simply look around us and check what's happening around. I forget the saint who said it, but said that we should have a double genuflection whenever we come across another human being. Just like we had double genuflections, you old-timers remember, when Jesus was exposed in the Blessed Sacrament on the altar. Normally, when Jesus was in the tabernacle, we just had single genuflections. Just went down on our right knee and that was all. Double genuflections meant when Jesus is exposed to us in the Blessed Sacrament, we should go down on both knees. Anyway, this particular saint, whose name I can't remember right now, says every time we come in contact with another person, we should have a double genuflection, according to canon law, which says we should also always double genuflect in the presence of Jesus exposed to us, because these people are exposed to us somehow or another. That would be an interesting thing to do, really an interesting thing to change customs that some of us grew up with and thought would never change. Thank you.